Good evening from Westminster, where thousands of people packed into the main hall here to hear what so many of them already knew. This was no accident. It was instead a calamity which could largely have been avoided. No accident that parents were left helpless watching their 7-year-old son die of AIDS. No accident that children still at primary school were left without parents. No accident that boys at one school were left to live with HIV and hepatitis, and the knowledge that 80 of their fellow pupils didn't survive. A human tragedy on a massive scale caused by the most grotesque human and systemic failings. Doctors lying, documents destroyed. Much of the most damning criticism directed at successive governments whose failure to act was, Sir Brian Langstaff, the inquiry chair, said, driven by the desire to save face and expense. Today, an apology from the government, resisted for decades.
This is a day of shame for the British state, and the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to its core.
Whatever the cost, we will pay it. The words of the Prime Minister on what he described as a day of shame. The scandal had already been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Today we learned it could largely have been avoided. The inquiry chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, pointed to the sheer scale of the tragedy, calling it horrifying. At least 30,000 people were infected with hepatitis C over the 70s and 1980s, and 1,300 were infected with HIV, including 380 children. More than 3,000 people are estimated to have died from infections attributed to blood or blood products, many of them haemophiliacs, given tainted blood as part of their treatment. Our Health and Social Care editor, Victoria MacDonald, was with survivors and families as they gathered to hear the damning conclusions of a report decades in the making.
Decades of waiting for the truth, and this was the man who finally brought it to them. Sir Brian Langstaff, chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry.
This disaster was not an accident. People put their faith in doctors and in the government to keep them safe, and their trust was betrayed.
It has long been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Thousands infected, affected and dead. Today, the long-awaited inquiry found systemic, collective and individual failures to deal ethically, appropriately and quickly with the risk of infections being transmitted in blood, with the infections when the risk materialised and with the consequences for thousands of families. Those infected were haemophiliacs or had other bleeding disorders, and then there were those infected by transfusions after childbirth or surgery, those with sickle cell or leukemia.
Factor VIII is literally a lifesaver for many of the country's 5,000 or so haemophiliacs.
This was because blood was not screened for hepatitis or HIV, and in the case of Factor VIII clotting agent for those with haemophilia, at least half of the blood plasma used here was imported from America and was from donors including drug addicts and prisoners. Jason Evans' father Jonathan died in 1993 after being infected with HIV and hepatitis C from Factor VIII. Mr. Evans has campaigned tirelessly for the answers.
It's extremely vindicating because for a long time, not just me, but many people have been making what have been considered to be claims and allegations regarding evidence. And now it's fact, and now it's on the record. For me, that means everything. And there's one part of me that feels I wish my father was here to see this day.
What is the key finding for you?
Well, for me, the core finding is that commercial factor concentrates never should have been licensed for use. If they hadn't been licensed for use, the scale of HIV infection would have been zero, if not very close to it. My father would most likely still be alive today, as would many other people, and so that's really important.
More than 2,500 pages, 7 volumes. This is a hard-hitting report. It talks about the failures of successive governments, of the medical profession closing ranks, of the stigma made worse by media reporting. It talks of documents that have gone missing or been destroyed. And most of all,
It talks of lives destroyed.
There were failures in allowing the importation and distribution from 1973 of blood products, in ensuring a sufficient supply of factor VIII, in ensuring sufficiently careful and rigorous donor selection and screening, and allowing continued collection of blood from prisons, and failing to make adjustments to treatment regimes to make them safer. The inquiry found that the agony was compounded by lines repeated that people had the best treatment available, that the infections were inadvertent, and that screening for hepatitis C could not have been introduced earlier than 1991. All were untrue. If one part of the report could be more shocking than another, it's what happened at Treloar's school in Hampshire, which specialised in teaching boys with haemophilia. The report found the children were experimented on, given large doses of factor VIII, even though the risk was known. 30 of the 122 pupils with haemophilia survive. Richard Warwick, who has HIV, was one of them.
It's really difficult for us because we had a lot of the teaching staff were great, you know, we got on really well with them. We got on well with the house masters and the doctors. I mean, some of the doctors, we treated them like friends. They'd invite us round to the homes on a weekend and we'd have coffee and biscuits with them. But it's actually incredible to think that they were actually researching and experimenting on us.
In the summary, the report says the pupils were often regarded as objects for research rather than first and foremost as children whose treatment should be firmly focused on their individual best interests alone. This was unethical and wrong. Treloar's school today acknowledged the national scandal and said they would now be taking time to reflect on the recommendations. For such a weighty document, the recommendations are concise, just 12, including that a compensation scheme should be set up now. There should be a permanent memorial to the victims. He calls for a duty of candour, that is, a legal obligation to say when something has gone wrong, and ending a defensive culture in the civil service and government, but above all, giving patients a voice.
I now call the Prime Minister.
And today, 7 years after the inquiry was announced, there was an apology.
Layer upon layer of hurt, endured across decades. This is an apology from the state to every single person impacted by this scandal. It did not have to be this way. It should never have been this way. And on behalf of this and every government stretching back to the 1970s, I am truly sorry.
But Sir Brian warned he would be watching to ensure his recommendations were acted upon. Delay, he said, not only causes frustration, but it compounds the harm and suffering many of those infected and affected have endured.
You know, I'm standing outside the hall where more than 1,000 people gathered today for the launch of this report. It was emotional, it was exhausting, it was cathartic, but as one campaigner said to me, tomorrow all the victims will wake up knowing that they no longer have to fight for justice. It isn't all over, of course. Tomorrow also we will hear more details about the compensation scheme, and as Sir Brian Langstaff said, he would be watching the government to make sure that they were taking on board the recommendations. What we won't necessarily hear about, and it's what some of the campaigners wanted, is corporate manslaughter charges. I asked at a press conference today whether they thought there was any realistic possibility, and I think there is a general admission that because of the delays, because of the obfuscation, that it is now too late for there to be any real possibility of bringing these charges.
Victoria, thanks very much. Well, I'm now joined by Suresh and Susan, who are two of the tens of thousands of people whose lives have been dramatically impacted by the infected blood scandal. Suresh and his brother were both infected following a treatment for their haemophilia in the 70s. By the time Suresh was 20, he'd been diagnosed with hepatitis C and HIV. In 1995, his older brother, Praful, died from AIDS, contracted from contaminated blood. He was just 34. Susan was diagnosed at 3 years old with haemophilia and was treated with infected blood. That event has cast a long shadow, sometimes leaving her frightened to touch her children for fear of infecting them. Thank you to both of you for joining us this evening. Some of the survivors today saying the world now knows the truth. You've lived with it for years and years. What does today mean to you, Susan?
Ultimately about vindication. You know, people like me, haemophiliacs, were told that we were given the best possible treatments available at the time. And we know that that's a lie and a myth that's been perpetuated for decades. I think that the inquiry report has cast a shadow over the last few decades where individuals and government collectively have lied to the haemophiliac community. We've been used and tested on like lab rats, and it is a very dark day in our country's history, and that over 3,000 people have died as a direct result of this scandal, and not here to hear the final report and to hear the Prime Minister's apology is nothing short of a national disgrace.
Suresh, your thoughts today?
Well, I feel vindicated for the day, for all the things that I've said in the past. And you know, after a while, you start convincing yourself that maybe you're the one who's crazy. You know, but what Sir Brian said, and the validation that is given to us and the community as a whole, I mean, it's second to none. You know, this day has been more monumental than I thought possible.
One of the terrible threads that run throughout this report is the disregard for people who were going through this terrible situation, the complete lack of respect. I mean, tell me how you found out you'd been infected with HIV.
I was first year of university, and I'd had a previous blood test done, and over the phone, the nurse says, "Oh, well, if you can't come in, is it all right if I tell you over the phone?" I said, "Yeah, that's fine," and I thought it was going to be a normal blood test. And she said, "I'm afraid to say that you're HIV positive." And I didn't really understand what that meant in its entirety. And then she said, "Oh, well, first of all, what you have to do is go home, sort your papers out." I said, "What's the medication?" She said, "Well, there is no medication. You only got 2 months to live." And that's how my life was. And I lived in a suitcase for the first year of university. For the first 2 months, I thought, I'm going to die. And that's how I lived my life. But the 2 months turned into 2 years, 20 years, and after 40 years, I'm still here.
I mean, that disregard, that disrespect for people in such trauma, do you recognise that?
Absolutely. You know, I was a haemophiliac going for regular reviews, clinical reviews at the hospital. These were like homes for homes from haemophiliacs. You get to know the clinical staff, the nursing staff. It's a very familiar environment, and there's that trust between you and the doctors and the nurses. And the day that I was diagnosed, I'd gone in to have a regular blood test, and my mum was sitting outside, and the nurse very casually said to me, "Susan, when we get on top of your hepatitis C?" And I said to her, I don't have hepatitis C, I don't know what you're talking about. She looked very taken aback, asked me to go and sit outside, and then my mum and I were called into the consulting room where we were told, "But Mrs. Lee, don't you remember at your last clinical review we told you that Susan had tested positive for hepatitis C infection?" And we know now, decades later, that was a lie. That never took place. It was only with the inquiry that we saw other families that had identical accounts to our own.
And give us a brief sense of what it was like to live with those diagnoses.
Well,
Suresh.
for me, it was a complete jail sentence, in the sense that you're trying to make relationships, you're trying to make friendships, and all the while in the back of your head you're thinking, I'm having this conversation, but I'm lying to them because I couldn't tell them the truth. You were a prisoner in your own body and living a life that you knew wasn't exactly 100%, because you're continually hiding some of the things, and that's not how you have a friendship.
I had a hereditary bleeding disorder, which I had from the moment that I was born, and then I was given another terrible infection on top of that. And at the time that I tried the treatment, which was a terrible treatment, it was interferon, and a clinician once said to me it was like using a nuclear bomb to kill a field mouse. It was hugely disproportionate. I had to have my heart restarted 18 times during the treatment, and my 2 young daughters at 3 and 5 had to witness all of that. So it's intergenerational harm. It's affected my children, it's affected my mother.
Your ability to be a mother.
Absolutely. You know, how can you feel confident interacting with your children when you know that you've got an infectious disease?
Did you feel frightened of
Absolutely.
of approaching them, of
and
cuddling them?
it robbed me of, you know, that love and closeness that I should have had with my children during that time, that I wasn't able to have, and I can never get that back.
In many ways today is about truth,
Yes.
but there is justice too. I just wonder how confident you are that you will get the justice that you're seeking.
Well, if it was left in Sir Brian's hands, I'd be 110%. But with the government, I'm a bit sceptical. until I see the proof of the pudding, I don't really believe it.
I think, you know, we've been lied to for so many years now. It's no more words. We need action. We need compensation for everybody that's been affected by this scandal, and to have, you know, systemic changes so that a tragedy like this never ever happens again.
And Suresh, I want to end with you. You lost your brother, Praful, because of this. I just wonder, you must be thinking a lot about him today.
Every day I think about him, but today more than ever, because he should have been part of this campaign, should have been part of this feeling of joy that I have at this moment in time. But along with all the other friends, they will not see this, and it's unjust.
And you lost many friends.
I lost many friends, and in 1 year I went to 70 funerals. And after the funeral, you'd be going to a party, and people were saying, well, you're not much fun. But I just buried my brother in the morning. How can it be fun? You know? But I couldn't tell them the truth, because that's what life was. It was a complete lie, and then you had to live it for 40 years.
So the next few days, the next few weeks, very, very important to you, I know. Suresh and Susan, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, earlier I spoke to Andy Burnham, who gave evidence to the inquiry. He's now the Mayor of Greater Manchester, but served as Health Secretary during the last Labour government. I asked him about his reaction to the report.
I said a few weeks ago that this report would rock Whitehall to its foundations, and it should rock Whitehall to its foundations. I am pleased to see Sir Brian confirm, in my view, what I said in my final speech to Parliament, that this was a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. The criminal word is mine, he just says cover-up, but I believe it is a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. I certainly would like to see prosecutions. There has to be full accountability here for what happened, alongside that full apology, a meaningful apology, and a full compensation scheme immediately.
If you were to crystallise what you think has gone wrong over decades politically, with the political system, there's been denial, disregard, disrespect for these
families. I explained, I'll answer that question as kind of directly as I can. I think the blame rests somewhere over there in the Treasury, because I know that they have had a sort of grip on this issue, that no statements admitting liability could be made by anybody. Because that was the view of the British state from the start, that the kind of fear of financial exposure couldn't be allowed to be opened up, and that was the grip that they put on this from the start. And I think that explains why the line never changed over the years.
And what do you think that has meant for the many, many victims of this?
It's re-traumatising. It's the original harm of the infection to loved ones, but then that re-traumatising effect of being left in the wilderness for all of those years, shouting to be heard. You know, it's just taken far, far too long for this day to come, but actually it would have been quite possible that this day never did come, because the cover-up was so orchestrated and was so strong. But finally it's been broken. But coming out of it, as I say, Whitehall should be rocked to its foundations. We need major reform to the way this country is run. Because look at the pattern here. Hillsborough, Post Office, today infected blood. The story is the same. The story is the same. A major wrong is done, and then it's covered up for decades, and the victims are left in the wilderness. How many more times are we going to allow this to happen to people? There must be a full Hillsborough law put on the statute book, with Sir Brian's recommendation of a statutory duty of candour on all senior civil servants. That is the only way we will break this pattern.
At the heart of all of this, all of these scandals that you've referenced, ordinary people not being listened to by the authorities, by Parliament, by ministers.
And they're there today, and it's heartbreaking in one way just to see everybody there. Honestly, the weariness on their faces, but today some elation and kind of the weight lifted finally off their shoulders. But they should never have been in this position, on this scale, for all of those years. A criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. That is what infected blood is, and that is why there now needs to be full redress on every level.
And you think prosecutions are part of justice?
And prosecutions also should follow.
Andy Burnham, thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you. The government failed to discharge its fundamental duty to ensure the safety of the public. The damning conclusion from today's report. And those failures spanned decades under Labour and Conservative governments, starting in the mid-70s, when the Department of Health ignored the dangers of contracting hepatitis from blood transfusions collected in prison. But the calamity worsened when HIV emerged in the early 1980s. By 1982, medical journals were saying the danger of passing on the infection through blood products was real. But it was only after newspapers started reporting the issue in May 1983 that the Department of Health paid attention. We now know that officials knew that it was very likely to be true that HIV could be transmitted in this way. Despite that, ministers, including Ken Clarke, the Health Secretary, continued to insist that there was no conclusive proof. Today's report says that false reassurance was indefensible and misleading. For decades after that, ministers and even prime ministers insisted wrongly that the victims had been given the best care available. They refused to allow a public inquiry, partly through fear of having to pay compensation. The report says that continued failure to examine what went wrong cannot be easily excused. Theresa May finally relented in 2017, but only after she had lost her majority at the general election, so could no longer resist. Well, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. I mean, the Prime Minister calls this a day of shame. Do you think many are feeling shame today?
I did get a sense just across the road in Parliament that there was a certain amount of shame. This is one of the biggest peacetime disasters in our history, and it didn't happen because of an explosion. It happened because of a sinister collapse of ethics. Keir Starmer was responding to what Rishi Sunak said. You heard a bit of that in Victoria McDonald's report. He said, politics failed you. He was addressing the victims of this saga. There has been a cross-party failure. Rishi Sunak tended to concentrate in what he had to say in the House of Commons on the medical failures, but he was asked by Dame Diana Johnson, one of the backbenchers who's made the running with this issue and got a lot of tributes today. She decided she wasn't going to let him get away with that, and she said, well, why didn't you start the compensation scheme a year ago when you could have done? He didn't exactly answer that, and he's not going to be around tomorrow when we get a big announcement on all of that. He's going to be somewhere else in Europe.
And do we know anything more about that announcement tomorrow?
There are some bits emerging. You heard Victoria's report quoting Rishi Sunak saying, whatever the cost, we will pay it. Well, clearly Sir Brian Langstaff isn't utterly convinced of that, and he hasn't formally closed his inquiry because he wants to keep tabs on progress. But we know that as recently as December, it didn't feel like government had crossed the Rubicon, that they were ready to pay this money for whatever reason. Loads of theories going around. Did they want more space to make sure they could do tax cuts in a fiscal event in the autumn ahead of a general election? But what you hear a lot of, though, is that there was just general anxiety in the Treasury about how high this bill could go. And I understand behind the scenes now there have been a lot of talks between lawyers acting for the families, independent experts and people at the Health Department trying to work out a sort of tariff of costs for different appalling, tragic stories, what the appropriate compensation might be in those cases. And although we may not get the actual tariff tomorrow, we may get the headline figure. And the suggestion knocking around Whitehall at the moment is that that 10 billion figure going around might be a bit higher than that.